Sometimes your life starts getting better, and that's exactly when you destroy it. Right before the relationship becomes real, right before the opportunity changes everything, right before stability finally arrives. You disappear, you procrastinate, you shut down emotionally, you create chaos where there was finally peace. And afterward, you sit alone trying to explain your own behavior to yourself, maybe staring at a message you suddenly stopped replying to, maybe sitting in your car at night because going inside feels strangely heavy, maybe deleting weeks of progress for reasons you can't fully explain because part of you wanted the life in front of you. But another part of you felt something dangerous approaching. That contradiction destroys people quietly because after enough self-sabotage, you stop trusting yourself. You begin watching your own behavior like you're observing someone else. You promise yourself, this time I won't ruin it, and for a while, you believe it, then the same pattern returns. Different relationship, different goal, different environment, same collapse. And after enough repetitions, people begin believing something deeply painful. That they are fundamentally broken. But most self-destruction is not random, and it is rarely stupidity. Most of the time, it is protection, because the nervous system does not care about the life you consciously want. It cares about what it believes is safe, and unfortunately, safe does not always mean healthy. Sometimes safe simply means familiar, even if the familiar thing is loneliness, even if it's rejection, even if it's emotional chaos. The brain is designed to predict survival, not fulfillment. Which means if suffering became emotionally predictable early in life, your body may still prefer it over unfamiliar peace. That is the hidden tragedy behind self-sabotage. People think they are destroying their future, but often they are defending an older version of themselves that learned survival through instability. And that changes the entire meaning of the behavior. Because suddenly self-sabotage stops looking impulsive, it starts looking adaptive. A person who grew up around emotional inconsistency may unconsciously distrust calm relationships. A person who only received attention through achievement may panic when resting. A person who survived through hypervigilance may feel anxious the moment life becomes quiet. Not because peace is bad, but because their body never learned peace was safe. Your nervous system can become emotionally attached to states that are hurting you. Not because you enjoy pain, but because predictability creates psychological control. And the brain will often choose controlled pain over uncertain change, even if the change is healthier. That's why people sabotage opportunities they prayed for, why they pull away when intimacy deepens, why they procrastinate hardest on the things that matter most, why they relapse right after progress, why they ruin stability the moment it begins feeling real. Because progress is not just external change, progress threatens identity, and identity is one of the most protected systems in the human mind. You think you're looking at who you are, but sometimes you're looking at who you had to become to survive emotionally. There's a difference. A child who learns that emotional needs create rejection may become hyper-independent. A child who learns love can disappear suddenly may become emotionally guarded. A child who receives approval only when performing may become addicted to productivity and validation. And after enough years, those adaptations stop feeling like survival responses. They become identity. I'm just distant. I'm just an overthinker. I'm just bad at relationships. I'm just self-destructive. But those labels hide the original emotional logic underneath them. Because even destructive patterns usually began as protection, and protection repeated long enough eventually becomes personality. That's why people can consciously crave connection while unconsciously fearing it. They want intimacy, but intimacy removes emotional control. They want success, but success creates visibility. They want peace, but peace removes the familiar emotional tension their body learned to expect. So the nervous system begins creating resistance, quiet resistance, invisible resistance. Not dramatic enough to recognize immediately, just enough hesitation to slowly destroy momentum. You delay one conversation, avoid one responsibility, ignore one opportunity. Withdraw emotionally one more time. And because the decisions feel small, you never notice the pattern shaping your entire life. Until eventually you look around and realize you have recreated the same emotional outcome in different forms for years. Different people, different jobs, different goals, same emotional destination, because the environment changed. But the nervous system didn't, and the terrifying thing about survival patterns is how convincing they feel. They don't feel irrational, they feel necessary. Self-sabotage often feels like relief in the moment. The nervous system says, good, danger avoided, even when the real danger was never external. It was emotional memory. And emotional memory is powerful. The body remembers environments your conscious mind no longer lives in. Sometimes someone compliments you, and instead of feeling proud, you feel exposed. Sometimes someone loves you gently, and your first instinct is to pull away. Sometimes your life becomes calm, and you suddenly feel restless for no visible reason, because the body becomes calibrated to whatever emotional atmosphere it survived in the longest. If your internal world was built around unpredictability, calmness can initially feel unreal, almost suspicious. Many people mistake this feeling for intuition, but often it's simply nervous system unfamiliarity, and this becomes especially dangerous during periods of growth, because every major transformation in life requires identity destabilization. The old version of you begins dying psychologically, and the nervous system often interprets that process as danger. That's why people sabotage themselves right before breakthroughs, right before commitment, right before success, right before emotional openness, because the closer you move toward a new identity, the more the old survival identity begins fighting back. Not consciously, automatically, the mind asks, if I become this new person, who will I be without the survival patterns that protected me? That question creates enormous unconscious fear, because even painful identities provide certainty, and certainty is emotionally addictive. People underestimate how attached they are to familiar suffering. Not because suffering feels good, but because it feels known. Predictable pain creates orientation. You know the rules. You know how to survive it. You know what version of yourself to become inside it. But peace? Peace creates uncertainty. Stillness removes distraction. Healthy relationships remove emotional guessing games. Rest removes performance. And suddenly, there is nowhere left to hide from yourself. That silence can feel unbearable for people whose identity was built around emotional survival, which is why healing often feels disappointing at first. People imagine healing will feel warm and transformative immediately, but often, healing feels empty before it feels peaceful. It feels slow, emotionally quiet, almost numb. You wake up one morning and nothing dramatic is wrong. No chaos, no emotional emergency, no conflict demanding your attention, just silence. And for some people, that silence feels unbearable. Because the nervous system was trained for intensity. Chaos creates stimulation, hypervigilance creates purpose. Emotional unpredictability creates focus. When those disappear, many people experience a strange psychological withdrawal. Not from pain itself, but from emotional familiarity. And during that phase, people often unconsciously recreate old suffering just to feel emotionally oriented again. Arguments, relationship sabotage, impulse decisions, self-isolation, overworking. Numbing behaviors, starting over repeatedly. Not because they truly want destruction, but because emotional survival mode still feels more familiar than peace. That realization changes the entire conversation around self-sabotage. Because now the question is no longer, why do I keep ruining my life? The real question becomes, what part of me still believes safety exists inside suffering? Because eventually you begin realizing how many of your behaviors were attempts to avoid emotional vulnerability. Overthinking prevents uncertainty. People-pleasing prevents rejection. Perfectionism prevents criticism. Emotional numbness prevents disappointment. Control prevents exposure. Withdrawal prevents loss. But protection has a cost. The more energy is spent avoiding pain, the less energy remains available for actually living. And eventually, people wake up inside lives built entirely around emotional defense, careful relationships, careful emotions, careful choices, careful self-expression. Everything managed, everything monitored, everything emotionally filtered. And after years of surviving that way, many people quietly lose contact with who they actually are underneath the protection. Because survival identities are exhausting to maintain, especially when the original danger no longer exists. That's why some people feel strangely empty even after getting everything they wanted, because achievement cannot heal an identity organized entirely around survival. You cannot outperform a nervous system that still believes the world is unsafe. And eventually, healing becomes less about becoming a better person and more about teaching the body that safety no longer requires self-destruction, that peace is not weakness, that rest is not failure, that love is not automatically temporary. That visibility is not always dangerous, that calmness is not a trap. And maybe, most importantly, that you no longer need suffering to feel emotionally prepared for life. But this process is slow. Because survival patterns do not disappear the moment you intellectually understand them. The body changes gradually, through repetition, through emotional safety experienced consistently enough to become believable. And at first, that new safety can feel uncomfortable, unnatural, even frightening. You may feel the urge to run the moment things finally become stable, the urge to disappear the moment someone sees you clearly, the urge to destroy progress right before your life changes, not because you truly want pain, but because your nervous system is trying to return to what it understands. And healing is learning not to obey every survival instinct automatically. It is learning to stay. To remain present long enough for the body to discover that peace is survivable too. Because healing is not only gaining new behaviors, it is grieving old identities, old coping systems, old emotional environments. Old versions of yourself that spent years trying to survive the only way they knew how. That version of you is not evil, it is tired. And many people spend their entire lives hating themselves for adaptations their nervous system created to survive pain. But self-hatred only deepens the pattern, because shame keeps the nervous system defensive, and defensive people cannot heal deeply. That's why real healing often begins quietly. Not with dramatic transformation, but with tiny moments of staying present instead of escaping, remaining emotionally open instead of withdrawing, allowing rest without earning it first, not recreating chaos when life finally becomes stable, answering the message instead of disappearing, sitting in the silence without needing to destroy it. Those moments seem small, but psychologically, they are identity revolutions. Because every time you remain inside peace without sabotaging it, your nervous system learns something new, that safety does not require suffering, that calmness does not mean danger is coming, that love does not always end in abandonment, that you can exist without constantly preparing for emotional disaster. And slowly, very slowly, the old survival identity begins loosening its grip. Not all at once, Not dramatically, just enough for silence to stop feeling threatening, just enough for stillness to stop feeling empty, just enough for your life to stop revolving around emotional defense, because maybe you were never secretly trying to ruin your life. Maybe part of you simply believed that chaos was safer than change, that suffering was safer than vulnerability, that control was safer than trust. And maybe healing begins the moment you realize the patterns protecting you have slowly become the walls imprisoning you.